This video aims to examine the contribution of Jules Barni, a French philosopher and historian, to the debate about Napoleon, with a bit of a focus on his influence on France and Europe, but I'll also map this onto the extent of Napoleonic reform debate because I think there's quite a clear overlap with those two. The aim that I'm basically pursuing here is trying to examine some of the key historiographical themes that you'd want to be discussing as part of the exam, and also just to get your head around the basic source that we're dealing with here. So we're looking at the historian themselves, Jules Barni, the purposes to which they turned in writing history and producing history, and also the way they constructed history and how that might talk about and discuss and demonstrate some sense of change over time. So remember that the fundamental thing here is we're trying to develop some breadth. So this source really relates to this second phase of historiography in the period, say, after Napoleon lived. So Napoleon obviously died in 1821, body repatriated into France in 1840, and then there was a big struggle for power in France between a great variety of groups, including perhaps most importantly Republicans versus monarchists versus Bonapartists as well, so people who wanted to restore a kind of new empire. So this is the phase that we're talking about. We've already had a look at the work of Emmanuel de las Casas, which relates clearly to this. We'll have a look at Bonnie Smith, who clearly relates to the third phase, and we'll have a look at some other issues later as well. So what we're doing here is trying to get the breadth, but also pick off a couple of very specific works and try to drill down into those works to see how and why interpretations differ in this particular debate. And that's where we get our depth for the exam. So Jules Barni, having a look at his basic biography, is a kind of complex character, so there's probably a little bit more on his biography that needs mentioning here. So he's a French philosopher and Republican politician. So he turned to politics in the 1870s, the last decade of his life, essentially. For most of his life, he was basically teaching and learning and writing philosophy. He was a contemporary of Adolphe Thiers, that should say, this keeps auto-correcting me. So Adolphe Thiers, who wrote a very famous work about Napoleon, perhaps one of the most famous, and I think the important thing here is that as we'll come to see, Barni was very much in contest with Adolphe Thiers. So that's an important part of the theme that we'll be discussing here as part of the historiography. It's also important to note that Barni worked for most of his career, especially through the 1840s, as a philosopher. He's most deeply interested in the ideas of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was an Enlightenment thinker, who was very much about rationality. So it's not necessarily important to know a lot about Immanuel Kant, but just the fact that Adolphe Thiers spent much of his time working with that material, among other things. It's also important to note that this is where we're starting to get very, very specific in terms of stuff that will be really relevant to your analysis of him as a source. He is a open Republican and also, perhaps more even strongly, an ardent liberal. And what that means is that he was emphasizing in his philosophy the need to protect the rights of individuals. So he is all about individual freedom and the freedom from government and so on to meddle in the lives of citizens. So he published many articles along these lines. If we Another example of this, or more evidence of this, is that he was actually appointed as vice president of what we call the Democratic League of Free Thinkers in 1848. So he's an active, he's an activist for liberal philosophy as well as a teacher. And I think that's an important part of how he reacts to Napoleon and how he reads Napoleonic history. It's important to note as well with Jules Barni that he was openly critical of the Second Empire. So this was basically brought to power after the coup in December 1851, when Napoleon III, so a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte I, the Napoleon we're studying, was brought to power in a coup in December, and the new empire began in 1852 and lasted all the way up to 1870. Jules Barni was a critic and an open critic. So one of the key testaments to this was the fact that while he was actually a teacher, so he was moved from university to a school, and part of the new school system was that the school teachers had to take an oath of allegiance to the new emperor and to the new regime. And basically Barni refused, and then over time sort of worked his way into exile. and he wound up in Geneva, which is a fairly progressive city in Switzerland, teaching philosophy, especially between 1861 and 1870. He was very active as a philosophy teacher there. He then returned to France after the Prussian invasion in 1870-71 and took up a position in the new government that replaced the Second Republic, and that was the Second Empire, and that was the Third Republic, actually led by Adolphe Thiers. If you might remember, he was the president of that. So Barni didn't take up a position in that government straight away. About a year or 18 months later, he took up that position basically and held that until his death. And it's interesting to note, there's not a lot of detail that I'm aware of on this, but the interrelationship between Barni and Thiers in that government was quite interesting. They had very different political philosophies, but Barni actually supported Thiers on a number of things. So he was willing to work with Thiers politically on this, but he certainly disagreed with how he understood many issues of politics and also many issues of Napoleonic history. The key work that we're talking about is this lecture series turned book, Napoleon the First and the Historian Thiers. That's basically the title of the book. It was a series of lectures delivered in 1863, which were then published into a book in 1869. And it was this book, so I'm going to take this date as the sort of the critical date here, the book itself, not the lectures. So we can talk about the lectures underpinning the book as part of the construction of history, but I would just use that as the date of reference here. So what's going on with the book? The context is essentially that France is obviously unsettled, okay, so it's still part of that contest between the Republicans, the monarchists, the Bonapartists, and so on, vying for influence over the direction of France. It's written in that time, but it's also written not in France, but while he's in exile in Switzerland, and he's also teaching philosophy and history there. So he's essentially an exile, an outsider looking back into his native country and trying to think about what happened, trying to think about what Napoleon did and what it all meant. He's also highly critical of the basic philosophy of Bonapartism, okay, which you could sort of think of as a sort of a type of enlightened despotism, which basically suggests that you can have a kind of ruler at the top of a society, and as long as they're basically interested in the will of the people and they're interested in the future of the people that they rule, then they can have some kind of dictatorial control. So it's not a dictator in the sense that maybe Stalin was a dictator, where many people talk about it, him using his power for his own ends. The idea of an enlightened dictator is that they're benevolent. So they're trying to do the right thing by society, but they do have most of the power in their hands. Barni is highly critical of that basic idea. He's fundamentally committed to liberalism. A liberal on the left, and that means he's not a radical socialist, though. That's an important point, is that he is all about human liberty, but he's not necessarily advocating some alternative radical system like socialism or anarchism or something like that. He is at this point arguing for a republican state and also a liberal republican state. It's also important to point out that in this context, the Superman image of Napoleon had basically become dominant in France. This is not alone the work of Adolphe Thiers by any means, but the work of Emmanuel de Las Casas and a number of other people had helped to promote the idea that basically Napoleon had tried to do the right thing and had actually been quite successful at that, and that he was seen as this some kind of like human above all other humans who had done this to a high degree. And that book, Adolphe Thiers' book, published between 1845 and 62 in 20 volumes, will become the key target of Thiers' work on Napoleon I. So this is the whole point of the book, as we'll see, becomes a critique of this book. This is also, just to stop and pause for a second here, if you're writing an essay, this is where you can get some extra breadth into your essay by even just focusing on one historian. If you're analysing Jules Barni, you can actually raise the issue of some wider historiography by pointing this out when you discuss the context. So without necessarily having to go into all this detail about Thiers, you can point out that this is an important part of the context, and it also widens your discussion of the historiography without having to have an entire paragraph perhaps on Thiers. So the aims and purposes of Barni, obviously fundamentally aimed at critiquing the work of Adolphe Thiers. I mean, that was the point of the lectures. It was to critically evaluate what Adolphe Thiers had said about Napoleon and basically put that under scrutiny. remembering that Thiers had made very bold claims about Napoleon. So he'd said that the days whose greatness was accompanied by so much wisdom, these are Napoleon's days, these were days whose greatness was accompanied by so much wisdom, and by that wisdom which prompts the hope of durability. The whole point that he's kind of making in these 20 volumes was that Napoleon was basically the ideal French leader who had restored the glory of France and done all this great liberalizing stuff, and brought power and security to the nation. And Barni is after that. He is after critiquing that idea. How can you come to that conclusion? What evidence do you have? How could you possibly say that? So it's aimed at critiquing that, but also I think this is in a more general sense. Barney's hoping to unpack and lay bare perhaps the problems with this general idea of Bonapartism, that you can claim to be a kind of emperor and also have the people's interests in mind. I don't think Barni agrees with that at all. It's interesting to note, when we think of how critical the book is perhaps of Napoleon's rule, the fact that the book was actually banned in the 1860s, the new Bonapartist regime thought it was actually undermining their entire kind of legacy, okay, or the legitimacy that they had, and therefore Barni's book was actually banned. So it was only really influential outside of France at this point in time. So in terms of the construction of history, there's a few things we can say here according to with this book. One is it's not aimed at this kind of historical task of finding, using, or promoting new source material, okay, or generally new methodology. You know, applying a new methodology to source material or something like that. He's simply out to critique a work. So think of this as a kind of a critical evaluation. I definitely don't say this in an exam or something, but think about this as a kind of Uber book review, where Barni is actually looking at the 20 volumes and unpicking it line by line to try and find flaws and problems with it and evaluate it. The historical analysis is clearly there. He's scrutinizing Thiers' facts, but he's also providing and demonstrating some moral and philosophical analysis that he's taking issue and taking to task Thiers' use of facts and documents and so on, but he's also saying there's a problem with this moral and philosophical outlook in general. So it's a kind of diverse critique of Thiers' work, you might think. I think it's also important to point out with the construction of history here that it's highly critical in its claims, but again, it's one of those texts where it's not necessarily just wildly polemical, okay? It's not attacking Napoleon necessarily as an evil figure or anything like that. It's critiquing the conclusion that he actually was a good leader. So it's not one of those wildly personal, even though his personal context, his story, and his philosophy certainly are an incredibly important part of Barni's interpretation, it's not wildly opinionated and random. Remember that Barni is a public intellectual. He has some degree of responsibility in the public sphere. If he was making silly claims, he'd get laughed out of town, and the people at the universities in Geneva who invited him to come and lecture and so on are just going to stop employing him. So he has some responsibility to be careful and philosophical and analytical in the process. Some of the key claims he makes. Well, firstly, he challenges Thiers' view that Napoleon essentially carried forward the best elements of the revolution. Okay, so he argues that he obstructed this. Think of De Las Casas here as well. De Las Casas basically argued the same thing as Thiers. So not only is Barni challenging Thiers, but he's also challenging the wider historiographical interpretation that says Napoleon was the heir to the empire and he carried forward the best parts of it. He's saying, no, that's actually not the case. So how does he, let's think of specific examples. How does he actually come to this conclusion? Well, he begins to unpick and challenge certain claims made by Thiers. For example, he says that many of the reforms actually reflected rather than destroyed elements of the ancient regime. So that is the old monarchies of France. So rather than acting to destroy the ancient regime, the old traditional order, and bringing in a new order, Barni actually challenges this idea and says, you know what, actually I think some of these reforms kind of mirrored many of the elements of the old monarchic empire. Example number one, he argues that Napoleon's use of prefects, so this is a sort of a regional governor, you might think of that, outside Paris, throughout the empire, basically who were directly responsible to Napoleon's regime, were quite similar to the Bourbon monarchs' use of what they called intendants. Okay, so out throughout the French kingdom, the Bourbon monarchs were using intendants who were basically directly responsible to them, and that allowed them to centralize power. So there's no kind of regional democracy, that's the point. And Barney's argument is that Napoleon changed the name to prefects and changed some of the title and the role and all this sort of stuff, but essentially it allowed him to control rather than open up democracy in the regions. A second example of this would be the fact that Napoleon also used this point here, that Napoleon's Legion of Honor. Many talk about the Legion of Honor as being a really meritocratic type of idea. It's worth reading up a little bit on the Legion of Honor, but basically it was like the highest honor you could achieve in France, and you basically became a public figure just by virtue of receiving this. Now, this wasn't given out, to everybody or anything. Many suggested that this showed that Napoleon was basically meritocratic. Now, how do they say this? Well, they suggest that if we look at the people who got the award, many of them actually came from a low-class background, which showed that if you were good at something, it didn't matter where you came from, you could wind up at the top of French society, so to speak. Well, Barni actually says that this was used to surround Napoleon with people who were loyal to him. And this was kind of like a court. Now, again, you could make the connection here with like a royal court, people who were basically connected and were basically tied to the monarchs or the king or the queen in some way. Barni is saying, how is it really very different to creating a kind of class of privileged people who are loyal to the person who gave them that award? It's not really that fundamentally different. So it's not necessarily progressive in his view. So therefore, you can say that he's basically challenging this fundamental view that Napoleon carried forward the best elements of the revolution. In fact, he didn't really destroy the ancient regime. It actually reflected key elements of it. And he even said openly, he says in one of his lectures, I can't remember which one it's in, but that Napoleon was actually the ruin of the revolution's dearest achievements. It can't get much more bold and clear than that. In terms of an evaluation, well, it's again evidence of this divisive nature of Napoleon. Okay, the argument out without end, according to Peter Geil, the legend versus black legend view, according to Jeffrey Ellis. It's also, again, another clear piece of evidence of how political ideology and personal context can play and have played a very powerful role in the debate. Someone who's a liberal philosopher claiming and coming to claim very much negative things about Napoleon's rule. This is obviously inspired by his understanding of philosophy rather than just understanding of sources and analyzing the empirical data. Okay. Also, I think you've got to remember that this is fundamentally opposed to a range of interpretations like De Las Casas, Thiers, and in the current world, people like Andrew Roberts, who tend to argue similar things about the Legion of Honor and so on. That Barni is actually going to take these other interpretations to task. I also think this is probably one of the most important points, and that is that Barni's perhaps a good example of how method and ideology are critical to the debate. This is not about new evidence. This is about actually critiquing someone else's work. And sometimes this is part of the whole process of historiography, is that historians don't go out to find new source material. They sometimes, and this is a good example, just go out to challenge how someone has put their own history together. So he builds a new and very powerful argument about Napoleon without really finding any new evidence. He's just challenging the logical connections that Thiers is claiming to make between the evidence he has and what he's concluding about Napoleon. So there's an interesting insight here. If you were asked to write about the role of evidence, here you could challenge whether evidence is always needed to come up with new interpretations. Finally, let's think about how it's relevant, Jules Barni is relevant to these debates. Well, firstly, in terms of the impact on France and Europe, he's obviously arguing that line that Napoleon destroyed many elements of the French Revolution and brought in a despotic period. So this is detrimental in Barni's view to France's general progress and the progress of liberal ideas more broadly. So his impact on France and Europe, fundamentally negative in Barni's view, with really not a lot to say positive about Napoleon. And finally, if we think about the debate about the extent of Napoleonic reform, well, he's arguing a very interesting line of argument here. He's actually arguing that Napoleonic reform needs to be questioned. What are we actually saying is Napoleonic reform, is part of what Barni is questioning. He certainly brought about the Legion of Honor, but did that fundamentally change and progress French society? He's suggesting no, in which case his conclusion has to be that there are severe limitations to the genuine reforming policies of Napoleon. In fact, many of the reforms, it seems, Barni is reading cynically. There's some ulterior motive, according to his view, which severely limits his ability to say, yes, Napoleon was a great reformer who basically changed all of society. And remember, one of the fundamental claims that he's making is that actually Napoleon kind of basically rebuilt a kind of French ancient regime, but with a different kind of facade.